Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Well, welcome everyone to the Community IT Innovators Podcast. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the host, and today I'm really excited to be talking to my friend Jeff Gibson from Build Consulting about data governance policies. So Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there. I'm Jeff Gibson. I'm with Build Consulting. They're a nonprofit consulting group out of DC, and got about 25, 30 years in IT. Operations, implementations, analysis, etc. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. Thanks for making the time to talk about this topic. So we have gotten some questions from some of our clients around not just creating policies for their IT governance, but specifically around data governance. And I know that you have a lot of expertise in that area. So can you tell us, why do you need a policy specific to data governance?
There's a litany of reasons, many of which is self-preservation for an organization. Not only compliance reasons, depending on what your industry is. I have some background in the education industry. That's HIPAA, FERPA, GDPR considerations, right? Just general right to privacy. The accessibility of the ease with which people can access malicious tool sets is the bar has been very much lowered in the last 5 to 10 years. So not only hardening the organization from an external threat, but also internally, you have a lot of people that are dealing with data that don't have a data specific background, that are using data as part of other tool sets. It's important, especially from a policy perspective, that your users understand the potential risk that they're incurring by how they use data, where they store data, who they share data with. One of the things that gives a short shrift all the time is vetting vendors and vendors that are service providers that you're sending your data to, and making sure you have a full understanding of what they're doing with the data. Are they, combining it with other data and aggregate to, determine their product outputs. What's happening with their vendors. Those kinds of things just get forgotten about all the time. So having policies that not only acceptable use for internal users, but external vendors. And then with your IT team, how are they storing that data? Where are the backups going? Are they backups encrypted? Are they, your cold backups encrypted? The other thing too that's really pushed a lot of this is cybersecurity insurance or cyber risk insurance. A lot of those coverage criteria are, in a nice way, they're outlined for you in the document, but also that really raises the bar for a lot of organizations that hadn't previously had a lot of compliance controls in place, or training for that matter. So there's a litany of policies. The most interesting one recently, and a lot of people don't think of it as a data concern, but it's probably one of the bigger risks that come up, is AI. AI just sort of insisted upon itself into organizations, whether it was brought in the back door generally by users who are like, hey, what's this nifty thing and how can it help me in my job? But also, and less so, what's the formal organizational AI policy? They're all very much in their infancy right now, and AI is ever changing, but it's important from a training perspective and an education perspective that users who are not traditionally in the IT area or data stewards, it's important that they're trained now in terms of understanding what the potential risk is for sharing external data within, the generative aspects of AI. That gets populated into the library, the global library of information. So if you have institutionally specific data, secret sauce information that makes your organization special, user data in there, or information about your users in there, that becomes part of a global library unless you intentionally tell it not to, or you have an internal instance of Copilot or something. So that one I think is probably recently the biggest one. And people don't really think, they just think, oh, here's a nifty tool that we can use and it'll help me. But what are you sharing? And it's important that everyone understands the implications of that, and then sort of retrofit the organization, because we're sort of, organizations and IT organizations are sort of being led by the nose to an extent by just the popularity, the wash of AI sweeping through all industries, really, if you think about it. So
Yeah, no, a lot of tools, like you get the update and it's like, here's your AI assistant. You're like, wait,
yeah,
I didn't know I was getting that.
I didn't ask for that.
So I want to put in a plug, just a quick plug, that we do have a template for an AI acceptable use policy for nonprofits on our website, communityit.com. If you're looking for something to write a policy specifically around AI in many different uses. But that leads me to a different question, which is, you could have data in lots of your different tools, IT tools that you're using or platforms that would be valuable to your organization. So, in your experience, does it make sense for a nonprofit to try to create some kind of a blanket data policy? Or does it really need to be where you do an assessment, you figure out which tools have which data, and then you write a data policy for when you're using your CRM or when you're using, AI for something else for your spreadsheets or, your list of volunteers or your list of clients that are receiving your services. So do nonprofits do those kind of policies piecemeal for the specific tool set, or do they do a broad one?
I think yes and yes. It depends on sort of where your risk lies. I mean, where are you at in this space and time? Do you have a ton of users who are sharing data externally, or do you have a ton of users who are adding new data? And is that data getting into your overall data repository or your disparate data repositories? And what kind of checks are being done on that data before it's introduced into the wider ecosystem? But if you have, generally, obviously, you want to have that blanket data security policy that covers a lot of your bases. It helps initially to help users understand, just really what they're dealing with. A lot of people don't have a lot of data specific training or the understanding of where that can go. But also, if you have particular risks in, again, say you're a nonprofit, a hospital, or a college, or any organization that has European contacts or constituents, or California for that matter, depending on where they're, you have, say, have GDPR considerations. You have, what do I do with this data? How do I delete this data? If called upon, how would I provide a receipt of sorts that this data has been destroyed, removed, or aggregated to an anonymity? The one thing too, that understanding in terms of the data use policy, but it also has to be developed and trained in tandem with whatever data retention policy your organization might have to have because of insurance or just what your operations are. Do you make sure that, I mean, for instance, just generically, most document retention policies are 7 years. There's smaller, there's longer, depending on what the business is and how they justify that retention. But if you make a data retention policy that's 20 years out or 15 years out because of the low cost of storage or whatever, that doesn't comply with your acceptable use policy in the organization. So you could be retaining data that another part of the organization is, certifying with compliance management organizations or external auditors that we've gotten rid of this completely. Yeah, it's in cold storage. Those kinds of things have to be taken in consideration of other policies that are in place. That's really why you want to have, and I'm not to dovetail off into another entirely different conversation, but a governance group, or some kind of governance team to look at the organization as a whole and make sure that, one policy isn't contradicting or in violation of another policy. That maybe the IT department's just responsible for data, but your document retention policy might be with 3 other organizations that have nothing to do with IT. So a governance team can kind of oversee all of those disparate pieces at an organizational level.
And I'll put in a plug that we did a great webinar in June, I believe it was, or May, in
I think it
May,
was May. Yeah.
about creating just governance, IT governance in general. And you had some really wonderful ideas and tips that were part of that webinar. So I'll let people go check that out themselves. But I think it leads me to ask you about the data itself. So I know for most, you know, regular people, consumers, individuals, we've heard a lot about the types of data breaches where like your credit card numbers got out or social security numbers because of Target or, some other company that had a data breach where they had a database that clearly hackers were very interested in. And so a lot of nonprofits, if they use a credit card processor, that's a completely separate from their data that they keep on, as we talked about, like constituents, students, volunteers, other individuals who are in your database. And so can you talk a little bit about, like, do you do a data assessment to know what data you have where and what is covered under these different compliance laws? And why should people be worried about data if it doesn't include things like credit card numbers or social security numbers? Like, why is data so important to your organization?
I'll flip the order of those questions, if you don't mind. With the addition of AI, you can take disparate pieces of data, assemble those, and have a pretty good notion of what that persona is, and use that data for either, just general malicious acts or taking over someone's identity. I mean, and that's probably one of the best ways to sell that to reluctant teams in terms of receiving training and things like that is, your information's in our database. It's in our HRIS system. It's in, your emails are in there. So assembling disparate pieces of information it's much easier than previously than it was previously, but also you can assemble, entirely different personas from people. You can one of the things for students in particular that was appealing was even if you have, social security numbers or some just anecdotal pieces of data, most students aren't checking their credit all that often. And a malicious actor and on the dark web knows that they're probably not going to be checking it for 3 to 4 years. So that data itself is much more valuable on the dark web because it says once you validate this, you have 3 to 4 years of runway to do it with it as you please before these folks are really going to be aware that they need to rein in their data. Same holds true. One of our vendors, I was a CIO of an organization, and one of our vendors had a data breach. It was nothing with us, but and 5-7 people had second mortgages taken out in their name. So and it's not little things, it's big stuff. But by the time, that's another thing to consider too, is your vendor notification policies. A lot of vendors, I've had vendors at third party vendors who have had breaches, but because of the legalese associated with what's a breach versus an unauthorized accessing, they can argue that for 6 to 7 months before they need to comply with their own notification policies. And the people who are affected have had 7 months of, malicious actors with their information and had no idea. So you really want to vet the vendors, vet the notification policies, the timelines, what they're including as a violation, legally speaking, or a breach, legally speaking. But then, so really, when we're training people, when we're talking to people about security, and we're bringing it home to them, like not just from the organizational perspective, but you're part of this organization. So your data, you're being a steward of your own data to some extent. 90% of people are going to care about the organization they work for and the data and protecting it. From a data assessment, it really is important, at least sort of, especially when one of the things I do is come into sort of less mature organizations or smaller teams where it hasn't been a priority, or they don't have the bodies to do the work, or they don't have the sort of best practice people. I think a basic cost of entry anymore is, where's my data? Where is it? Even if it's disparate sources, it's a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If you have disparate sources, it's much harder to manage across an organization. But then if you have, you've done the work and you have a centralized data repository, both need to be hardened, both need to be managed, both need to be backed up and ensured from a security perspective that it's part of your overall security planning and policy. Sort of top three for me are data set. Where's my data? Map your data, map how it's used, map when it was last used. Is it still relevant anymore? Are we incurring unnecessary risks because we don't use this data all the time? Can we purge it? The second one would be, getting those at least basic policies and training in place for your end users. Just rudimentary stuff. They don't have to know why or how, but the why might help them sort of internalize it and act upon it readily. Then IT just came with some memo that I'm just going to use as filler. But then the third thing is at least, if not once a year, every couple of years, just because is having an external penetration test. It's almost emotional because you're as an IT leader, you're sitting there going, I don't have to make people for this. I don't have the time. I have 1,000 front burner items. At least knowing where your weaknesses are will help you sort of incrementally bolster those areas, or conversely, centralizing that data to make management easier. But if you don't know, then you're it's your best guess. It's the things that keep you up at night are the things that you don't know. You can, an external penetration test is, you can get one for $3,000. You can get them, $50,000. It just depends on how involved you want to be. But at least at a rudimentary level, I think any organization should know where its weak points are, whether it's data or your infrastructure. They're one and the same. So I think those would probably be, for a smaller nonprofit organization, those would probably be my top must-have items, especially given all the change in data.
Yeah, I think one of the things we run into with smaller to medium-sized nonprofits is they aren't very centralized because often they're very entrepreneurial. So you have someone in the department who will see a need that they have, that a database that they want to build up for their program that they're doing, or for marketing, or major donors, whoever it is, and they'll be using that tool often very independently from the rest of the organization, just getting their job done. Like, they don't have time to do a big coordination, but certainly even in the smaller organizations. But once you grow to a certain size, I like your idea of having the committee, a governance committee, that could maybe do that assessment or hire someone external to come and help with an assessment to really map out who in which department is building these databases, and then do they have all the training they need on why the security is important, and are they getting those vendor agreements so that they have them and they're updated so that everybody knows. And that could be centralized in one location where you have all of those policy documents. So do you have any parting words from us on how to get started doing this? If you don't have a data policy now, what would be the first couple of steps that you would take?
I think the acceptable use policy is obvious step. There's so many templates out there. Community IT has one. The acceptable use policy is probably you're just, as soon as you walk in the door of IT management. Same thing with the vendor. Let's take the easy pieces first. There's templates out there for vendor vetting, templates out there to obviously control acceptable use. There's already templates out for AI policies, and there's just one-sheeters that you can give to people in sort of brown bag sessions, or maybe you have an IT newsletter, or a senior leadership meeting, and just start that conversation. The other thing is to take those policies and get your non-IT leadership talking about that. Obviously have the conversation in the background. What's the organization's posture on AI, blah, 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 posture on data, those kinds of conversations. But in parallel, I think at least, even if the cake's not baked, get out there, have leadership be consistent and persistent in their messaging. Like, this is a thing. This is how we can use it. It can be a tremendous benefit, but there's also risks involved. There's institutional knowledge that can get out there very easily. And just even explaining the rudimentary differences between sharing your inquiry data with the world or just keeping it in-house, or, how to anonymize data just to get an answer from an AI situation. And I think that the other one is just having anyone who's able to sort of sign a vendor contract or be involved with data or migrate data, that team or that department lead or that, whoever's managing that data has to understand what they're doing and the potential risks involved so that they can really justify what they're sharing too. That's another thing that real quick is people need to, share what you need to share, but it's always easier just to dump a file over to a vendor, but you're probably giving them 80% more information than they need to give. So really, what are you trying to get out of this? What does that vendor need? What's the vendor going to do with the information? If you can kind of get those three things in line, then you're pretty well on your way, but also internally, always being aware of how to minimize risk to data from external and internal sources. But even for, there's very little money involved in anything I just mentioned. So it's just the biggest currency of all, it's time. But it should be viewed as a priority that it hasn't been, in past decades or even 5 years ago anymore. So.
And I get a little bit nervous because I feel like I hear people in the nonprofit sector getting really excited about AI, and that AI is going to maybe fix a lot of their poor data management problems. Because even if you haven't been really on top of your data, but you've been keeping these maybe old databases or, data on your major donors or what have you, and there's going to be tools that are going to help you sort out what's in your database. But if you haven't gone through and done that assessment and know what's in your database to begin with and who has permissions to access it, and then have those vendor agreements, if you're doing an AI, bringing in an AI tool to analyze some data that you have, making sure that you do all of that homework or prep work, I guess I would say, before expecting an AI tool to just slice your bread and butter it for you as well.
Yeah. I always look at AI as, at this stage, it could be completely different tomorrow. At this stage, I look at AI as a labor supplement, not an intellect supplement. You're still driving the bus. You just have more people helping you maintain it, or, however long I want to extend that analogy. But I just don't think we can, sort of give it up and go, AI is right, I'm going to do whatever it tells me, because it really only is as good as its inputs. And people need to control how much of their data is being used as an input.
Those are all such great suggestions for us, Jeff. I appreciate your time today so much. And
Absolutely.
I hope that this is helpful to our audience to understand more about why data is so important to nonprofits and how to begin making those data policies if you don't already have them. So thank you again for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.